Thank you so much, Chayana, and welcome to everyone. I am very honored and pleased to have this opportunity to meet with such an amazing group of ICH bearers, practitioners, and researchers. So I feel really flattered, and I hope that this first module that is aimed to present to you the origins of UNESCO and the origins of the 2003 convention you will find interesting and helpful. If you encounter any troubles regarding the presentation or the translation, or you feel that I should speak slower, please do not hesitate to interrupt me. As well, if you have any questions in the meantime of my lecture, please interrupt me by showing your hand in the Zoom or just by placing your question in the chat. I will be very happy to break my narrative and to answer to any question you might have. So the 2003 convention. Now my presentation is not working. I'm not sure why. It doesn't change the slide, or maybe you can see the slides changing, but I can't see. Yes. Now
you should start it again. Because,
you see me, but can you see the presentation? Sorry. Okay, sorry, something then happened. Now I hope you will see. Okay, you see it now. That's great. Thank you. So my speech will be divided into 3 parts, and obviously the third part explaining to you the ecosystem of the 2003 convention will be the main one. However, this must be preceded by the part in which I will tell few things about how UNESCO the idea of UNESCO was born and how it was turned into practice, and in the second part, how the concept of heritage has been born under the auspices of UNESCO, and this will be a perfect bridge to tell how it was radically changed by the 2003 convention. So let me start with the beginning, because quite often we start exactly with the 2003 convention, and we forget that the idea to protect heritage, not of single nations, but for the sake of humanity as a whole, has roots already in the 19th century. The 19th century in Europe was a moment when the nation states were born, and obviously the interest in folklore as an element to support creation of nation states was very vivid that time. And at the same time, parallelly to this romantic nationalism, the idea that we need to protect some important elements of heritage in one country, not for the sake only of this country, but for the sake of humanity, emerged. And it was the case, the famous case of Venice, that experienced already in the 19th century troubles regarding the floods that were coming to the city. And so you need to remember that when we think about safeguarding some elements of heritage for humanity as a whole, we are coming back not to 2003, not even to 1972 World Heritage Convention, but even to the 19th century. And this trend in thinking was quite important to build institutionalized initiative that were important to protect some elements of heritage. For this moment, monuments, so tangible heritage, was of paramount importance. But then it was slightly developing. So we call this trend cultural internationalism, that considers cultural property a common human culture, a components of common human culture, whatever their places of origin or present location. And this idea, born in the 19th century, is actually well reflected in the names of most important, most famous UNESCO heritage lists. So World Heritage List and the representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. So humanity and world are in the names of these UNESCO lists, allowing us to come back to the origins of the idea. The idea was born, but before it turned into intergovernmental, more institutionalized efforts, it took some time. So the first ideas and the first institutes that were created to support international intellectual cooperation were done under the auspices of the League of Nations. League of Nations was an international organization that was set up in the interwar period and is considered to be a predecessor of the United Nations organizations, of the United Nations system. So in 1922, the first commission was set up under the auspices of the League of Nations that was composed of brilliant intellectuals and researchers. One of them was Maria Skłodowska-Curie. I'm sorry, but also Albert Einstein and other famous researchers. Soon after that, the Institute of International Intellectual Cooperation was established in 1926. And the efforts and the first discussions that happened there were instrumental when the Second World War broke up. Obviously, the activities of these institutions during the war were suspended. But quite soon, already in 1942, so 3 years before the war ended, the Conference of Allied Ministers of Education was set up with the view to think and reflect on how to establish peace and how to protect the young generation that was destroyed mentally, physically by the Second World War, how to protect this generation from radicalism, from racism, and from the problems that were actually paving the way to the Second World War. So the Conference of Allied Ministers of Education was very important. I'm so sorry, something happened. I just need a minute. So actually this conference was very important because these were the exact direct origins of UNESCO. So how the UNESCO was born? It was, as you can see, not something that happened as a surprise or as an accident or something that was not that was the idea of only few people. It was, I would say, a culmination of a very specific trend of thinking that we need some form of intergovernmental, international dialogue that will help to defend peace. And you can see here the famous words from the Constitution of UNESCO that are valid and they are brought back also today, also 20 years during the 20 years of the anniversary of the 2000 convention, but also because of the situation we are facing currently in Europe. So these famous words speak that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So for the first time, we see the very strong connection between thinking of culture, education, and science as an elements that need to build peace, justice, and liberty. And this was considered in the preamble of the UNESCO Constitution as a sacred duty to which all nations shall contribute. This was not very, this is sometimes forgotten today when we think only about the heritage. But this will be important to bear in mind when we will consider some problems that we face now when we speak about the protection of heritage in emergencies, in armed conflicts, in current struggles that we face, for example, in relation to migrants, heritage coming with them to different countries. So we need to think all the time, even when we think about intangible heritage, as something that should finally brought us to more peaceful dialogue, to less tensions between the nations. And here I wanted to make, yes, I can see a question coming. A hand is up, please. I'm not, I can see a person, but without a name, who has raised her hand or his hand, but I'm not sure if we can. So maybe, yeah, I can't hear either. I can see that the person is trying to connect with the voice. So maybe in the chat, if there are some struggles in the voice connection, we can try to place the question in the chat. So now I would like to display a very short movie prepared by the Austrian Commission for UNESCO that I found very, very nice and very clear in explaining also how the concept of heritage was born under the auspices of UNESCO. So now a short, I think it's 2-3 minutes movie.
In order to learn from the devastation and destruction of the two world wars, to promote understanding between peoples, and to secure peace, UNESCO was founded in 1945 as the Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization of the UN. A remarkable event strengthened further international cooperation. Following the construction of a dam in the 1960s, the ancient temples of Abu Simbel were literally on the verge of sinking. An international rescue mission prevented this by dismantling the monuments and rebuilding them on higher ground. This successful project raised awareness about the fact that all over the world there are places that are of outstanding value to all mankind and which therefore must be protected from threats such as armed conflict, deliberate destruction, economic pressure, natural disasters, and climate change. The idea of the World Heritage was born. In 1972, the first member states of UNESCO signed the World Heritage Convention and committed to preserving natural and cultural monuments and sites of outstanding universal value on their territory. For a site to be included in the World Heritage List, it must first be nominated by the country in which it was located. The nomination is examined by international experts who decide whether the inclusion in the list is justified. Finally, the World Heritage Committee, a body of 21 elected states, takes a vote. World Heritage Sites shows the diversity of cultures and natural phenomena that are tangible evidence of the bond between human beings and nature. The UNESCO World Heritage contributes to the preservation of these remarkable places and to promoting cultural exchange, dialogue, and peace in a sustainable way.
So you might feel surprised why we are actually displaying the movie about the World Heritage here, but just it is a place to stress the importance of the huge, enormous, universal success of the World Heritage Convention that was adopted in 1972. So the convention that was born out of the need to help solve the problems of countries, such as in Egypt, that were facing developmental economic problems and that needed to shift their important monuments to another place in order to regulate the Nile. So here we have the situation where international campaign launched by the UNESCO helped to protect by dismantling to another place monuments of Nubia because of the construction of the Aswan Dam. And the idea came back that these monuments must be protected because it is not only the need of Egypt to protect them, but they are part of a common heritage. So this idea that I was speaking all the time that was born in the 19th century, but at the same time, we can even probably trace this idea to some even ancient times. But this is a moment, a breaking point for UNESCO, and they start to work on the World Heritage Convention. However, the World Heritage Convention is not the only instrument in which we can see that the idea of the need to protect heritage of humanity is being embedded into international legal regulations. And obviously, after the Second World War, you can think that the massive pillage and massive destruction of cultural property was so shocking that the first convention that had to came out of UNESCO was aimed at protecting cultural property in the event of armed conflicts. So this first, I would say, cultural heritage convention is the Hague Convention 1954 with its two protocols. Then, before the World Heritage Convention was born, the convention that was preventing illicit trafficking of cultural property was adopted. Also important convention in the context of the new independent developing countries that were heading towards international arena and which markets, art markets, were grabbed by different investors, and the property coming from these developing countries, Africa, Latin America, were flooding art market in the West, and they were not protected. And then the World Heritage Convention that was born out of the success of the Nubia campaign, and that brought the idea 40 years later that we also need this second launch. We have two launches, and we have one, the tangible heritage launch and the intangible heritage launch of heritage. But in the meantime, we also see in 2001, the Underwater Heritage Convention. So we see that there is a whole complex of different instruments protecting different aspects of heritage, with Cultural Diversity Convention adopted as the last one in 2005. We call these 6 conventions 6 UNESCO cultural conventions, but each of these conventions has its own history, its own purposes, its own bodies, organs, definitions. So each of those 6 conventions shall be treated as a separate one, as a separate document. But at the same time, treating them as separate documents, we need to see them as a system, and we need to see the efforts on the side of UNESCO to create this system that will help to embrace different aspects of cultural activity of human beings. So how this path to the 2003 convention was born? We can actually see the growing appreciation of the need to employ a broader, more anthropological notion of culture. If we think about monuments, these great elements, tangible elements of human cultural activity, they were considered as belonging to so-called high culture. So culture who was mainly targeting the elite audience, the audience that regularly goes to museums, travels to touristic sites, is active in libraries, in so-called high cultural life. But in the 80s, these elitist notion of culture started to be changed, and we can see this reflection of the need to broaden our understanding of culture in the definition that was adopted in the 1982 Mexico City Declaration on Cultural Policies. This Mexico City Declaration will come back soon because last year we were celebrating the 40th anniversary of this declaration, and a new declaration, new Mexico City Declaration, was adopted. And I will come back to that later. But here in the 80s, we can see that culture is considered to be the whole complex of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features that characterize a society or social group. It includes not only the arts and letters, so the high culture, but also modes of life, the fundamental rights of the human being, value systems, traditions, and belief. So we can see this, the elements even of the current definition of intangible heritage here in this definition of culture in Mexico City Declaration. And out of these discussions and out of different initiatives taken also on the side of Latin American countries who are struggling with the protection of their traditional cultural elements, their traditional knowledge, their traditional music elements that were exploited for growing international market, the idea that we should adopt some recommendations on safeguarding traditional culture and folklore was born. And in 1989, these recommendations were adopted. But it is important to understand that the term recommendation says it was not a legally binding document. When we recommend something, it just say, you may choose to go this direction, but you are not obliged to choose this way. So it was a soft law document, so not very binding law, but it was an important step in the international reflection that we need some instruments to protect traditional culture and folklore. And it was also a very important moment where ethnologists, folklorists, anthropologists were engaged in working on this text. 10 years later, a huge conference that was trying to assess whether recommendation is working or not was held in the Smithsonian Institution. It was co-organized with UNESCO. And 10 years of the functioning of this recommendation proved that it was not very useful instrument. It was useful in terms of creating a reflection instrument, but when it comes to the needs, the practical needs, it was too much oriented toward researchers' interests. And it was using the term that time already was considered to have also negative connotations, that is folklore. For many, especially developing countries, the term folklore was perceived as denigrating, as degrading their culture. So there was a recommendation to find a different term instead of folklore and traditional culture. It is important to see that there are already some intellectuals, some activists who were important for this reflection going on, Antony Seeger, for example, but also it is important to see the role of International Council of Traditional Music, which is now an NGO accredited to the 2003 convention. So we see that we are struggling in the 1999 with the idea that we need more effective instruments, but also instruments that will help us to think about traditional culture and folklore in an innovative way, in a way that will not constitute and will not lead to some negative connotations, to some negative thinking about this instrument. And you can see that from the 1999 to 2003 were only 4 years. So it's when it comes to thinking in terms of international law drafting, this is very, very short time. But this very short time could bring the very relevant convention because of the work that has been done decades earlier. And the 2003 convention was adopted when the director of UNESCO was Koichiro Matsuura, the Japan diplomat and politician, and who was very familiar also with the concept of protecting bearers of heritage, bearers of practices, a program that was developed in Japan already in the 50s and in the 60s. And he was thinking that this convention, and he was very instrumental in giving the way and mobilizing different states parties to adopt this convention. So we need to think that this convention was heavily influenced by wider and earlier international policy context for culture, for development, and for human rights. And that this legal document was also very much influenced by a number of non-legal disciplines. So ethnographers, anthropologists, historians, political scientists, they were all needed and they were all involved in drafting of this convention. And so we think about this convention as a very interdisciplinary one, not only in terms of the experts representing different disciplines, but also different areas of reflection, how we should protect heritage and how to name it, how to create an instrument that will be available for every country, that will be simple, but at the same time encompassing very complex area of intangible heritage. So you can see here some important components that were embedded in the discussions about the new convention. It was important to say that it is a human right to have our traditions protected, safeguarded, but was also important to value cultural diversity of the world that is diverse not only in terms of tangible monuments, but also in intangible practices. It was very important and a new thing then that we need to take a participatory approach towards heritage safeguarding. So it cannot be done only by state. It cannot be done only by public authorities. It must include very diverse stakeholders. And in this sense, it was a crucial element to say that these stakeholders that shall be taken into account are communities, groups, and individuals. So you see that even if we are drafting a very legal document, at the same time, the cultural framework was very much taken into account. And here I would like to show you again a short movie about the concept of shared heritage, because I was trying to tell you that the idea of world heritage and heritage of humanity are longer with us, even than UNESCO. But here, when we speak about the world and the humanity, we are very much focusing on what we share together and why it is important to not only to share, but to take common efforts in safeguarding the different elements of heritage. So here is a very, very nice movie that will help us to understand why sharing is also a third element when we speak about heritage. World, humanity, and sharing is essential.
Our culture, our living heritage. They are an open book of our collective diversity. Thousands of UNESCO World Heritage sites, cities, and landmarks from around the world. Symbols of identity and history, each with unique emotions and values, because culture is a global public good. It's our shared heritage. It connects us all, building bonds and bridges among people, giving shape and meaning to our collective progress. This is the value of cultural heritage. But this heritage is fragile. Threatened by wars and looting, by climate change and rising sea levels, globalization and neglect. We must unite to protect and preserve it, pushing our governments to enforce international cultural law. We must unite to pass it on to future generations, backing UNESCO's efforts to support artists, museums, and sites from around the world. Because without our diverse cultural heritage, we lose a reservoir of ideas for us to reinvent our societies, to unleash creativity, to generate solutions, and write the next chapter of our human history. We must become more than the sum of our parts and contribute to the growing inventory of our shared humanity. The more we share it, the more we all thrive, connect, and understand one another. Sharing humanity is promoting cultural heritage and diversity. Join the share.
I hope you enjoyed it. And you can see in this very, very nice movie how we can think about sharing. And actually sharing will be one of the important components of the definition of intangible heritage. And you can see how UNESCO is also changing the discourse. It is not only about sites, it is not only about monuments, it is also about intangible practices that we share. So we are building, thanks to the 2003 convention, a new concept of heritage, a concept that is much broader and much more complex. Here I would like now to turn to the 2003 convention that was so instrumental in changing this discourse of heritage and changing this concept of heritage. Each legal document is structured in a, I would say, similar way. So here I would like to invite you to take a global look at something that sometimes may sound to you as a distant thing, especially if you are not a lawyer. When you think about legal regulations, you might feel a little bit not happy to deal with it. Yes, it's something complicated, but not necessarily. The structure of every international convention is usually quite similar. So we have a preamble, which is a part of the text that speaks about the ideas lying behind drafting of the document, speaks about other instruments, speak about the context, why we need this instrument. And the preamble is, I would say, selling the spirit and the context in which the document was drafted. Then we have some general provisions part, because we need to know what is the document about, what are its purposes, what are the definitions. If we speak about intangible cultural heritage, we need to know what it is. So general provisions usually will help you to understand most important elements of the convention. Then we shift into the part that helped us to understand what are the bodies responsible for what elements in different and what are their responsibilities, what are their duties, their obligations. So we have the second part that speaks about organs of the convention. and I will speak about it later. It's General Assembly, Intergovernmental Committee, the Secretariat of the 2003 Convention. There is a role of advisory organizations accredited to UNESCO. So the organs of the conventions speak about the bodies responsible for enforcing the idea of the text. Then we have the third part in the convention that speaks about safeguarding at the national level. And it is not something surprising, because actually we need to keep in mind that UNESCO helps different countries to discuss, to protect, but the main responsibility and the main effort is done on the country level. So safeguarding at the national level is a necessary step in order even to think about safeguarding at the international level. So most of you probably know that you, for example, cannot nominate any intangible heritage element from your country directly to UNESCO unless it is proved that it has been taken under the protection of some national system, national inventory, some national educational programs. And here at the national level, we speak about the participation of communities, groups, and individuals, because we cannot send our communities to Paris. We need to discuss with them in their language, in our state level, local level, regional level, municipality level. So I would say that despite the international attention that is given mainly to listing on the international level, to inscriptions on UNESCO list, the most important work for communities is done on the national level. And this instrument helps us to understand what we can actually do at the national level. So it speaks about inventorying, it speaks about different forms of education, formal and non-formal. It tells the country about the need to engage communities in the safeguarding efforts. So I would say that this third part helps every state party to the convention understand what it can do when it comes to safeguarding ICH. Then we have the fourth part, which speaks about safeguarding at the international level. And actually we have only 3 articles in the convention in this part, and each of this article concerns a different listing. So we have the representative list, the most interesting list for most countries, but we have also the urgent safeguarding list, and we have the register of good safeguarding practices. So this free listing mechanism, by helping to make visible and to understand in practice how ICH is manifested, are in this listing mechanism. Then we have the 5th part that speaks about international cooperation and assistance. We have a different option to ask for international assistance for some money to help us organize some actions at the country level. We have also ICH fund. So the fund that is composed of obligatory for each state party donations, but also a fund that is composed of non-obligatory voluntary contributions of different states that would like to support some initiatives, some developments in the convention. For example, the global reflection on the listing mechanisms and some changes that happened to them during last 2 years were sponsored by the government of Japan. The current reflection on the changes in the register of good safeguarding practices is sponsored by the governments of Sweden. So you can see that there are some countries that would like to support some concrete initiatives, but there are also obligatory donations. The 7th part speaks about reports. Reports are a very useful instrument because they help us to understand and to collect data and information from states parties to the convention on what they have done on the country level in order to safeguard ICH. And the periodic reporting here, because it's not, reports is a broad term. It considers both reports from states parties, and these are called periodic reports. Every 6 years, a country is obliged to take part in the periodic reporting. Now we have went through the exercise of regional reporting, and you were also involved with Poland in this. But we have also reports that are prepared by some organs of the convention. For example, the Intergovernmental Committee asked the Secretariat to prepare a report on some topic. Then the committee prepares a report that is submitted to General Assembly. So reporting happens both from the national level to UNESCO, but also among the organs of the convention. And the final parts are related to some sort of transitional clause. A transitional clause in this 2003 convention was aimed at taking 90 elements from the program of the masterpieces of oral and intangible heritage of humanity into the representative list. So the program I'm speaking about was preceding the convention. It had its 3 editions in 2001, 2003, and 2005. And when the convention entered into force, it was adopted in 2003, but entered into force in 2006, the inscriptions made to the program of masterpieces were taken to the representative list. So these first inscriptions happen by taking these elements. And this is why we call it transitional clause. So how this was solved by these articles. And final clauses speaks usually about how to submit the documents of ratification, what are the authoritative languages, how you can actually submit some amendments. So more legal procedural issues. So if you think that every international convention is built in a usually similar way, that it doesn't look so frightening, I hope. And now I would like to go with you step by step, but not into super details that will put you to sleep, but just to go with you through these elements. So we will start with the preamble. Preamble as an inventory of ideas that were important for drafting of the convention. So you can see only part of the preamble because it is a quite long document, but it speaks about human rights instruments, which were important for thinking about why we should safeguard intangible heritage. And we have these instruments named Universal Declaration, Covenants on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and on civil and political rights. Then we have the idea of cultural diversity and sustainable development. These are the concepts very important for the convention, and they are also developed not only on the UNESCO level, but on the level of the whole United Nations organization. And I speak about the Agenda 2030, which is the Sustainable Development Goals Agenda. So the concept of sustainable development is quite crucial for intangible heritage too. And it is also developed in the operational directives. Then we have the idea telling us that intangible cultural heritage does not exist solely. It exists in interdependence with tangible and natural heritage. And actually, we will see this in the definition of ICH. These are also objects, artifacts, some tangible elements, clothes that we need to dance, some crafts instruments needed for crafting. So we speak here, and this is very, I would say, revolutionary about this interdependence. But also we speak about, again, humanity, common concern, and universal will. So the idea that we have traced already in the 19th century in the League of Nations and then in the UNESCO Constitution. So there is something that transcends the national boundaries, this common concern and the need to protect it for future generations of humanity. And here also we have this very important element already in the preamble, that these are communities, also indigenous communities, groups, and in some cases individuals that play an important role in production, safeguarding, maintenance, and recreation of intangible cultural heritage. This is revolutionary. This is why in many contexts, this convention is named the most democratic convention. Why? Because you are very much familiar with the idea that these are states that are ratifying the conventions. These are states that are represented at the intergovernmental level. But here it is clearly said that it is not the state solely that can take responsibility for safeguarding ICH. It must do so in full cooperation with communities, groups, and individuals. So they are for the first time acknowledged in this Heritage Convention. And also you will see here the reference to the Convention for the Protection of the World Cultural and Natural Heritage. So the convention that we have spoken already a little bit about, the Convention of 1972, that was a pattern, that gave a pattern to follow when the 2003 Convention was drafted. So what is intangible cultural heritage? We have spoke a lot about the needs to take these aspects into account when thinking about what constitutes heritage, but what it actually is. So the definition here, as you can see, is long. That means it's complex and it's not simple. And it speaks that these are practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, and here are these tangible elements. So instruments, objects, artifacts, cultural spaces which are associated with them. And now democratic element that communities, groups, and in some cases individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. This is why you actually cannot take any actions when you speak about intangible cultural heritage safeguarding without the consent of communities, without their participation. And here also a very important element. It must be transmitted from generation to generation. So it is not a very new practice, at least it is considered, though the definition doesn't speak itself, but it is considered that we shall have at least 2 generations in order to speak about intangible cultural heritage. And this intangible cultural heritage is recreated by communities and groups in response to their environment, interaction with nature. So we have this natural element embedded here, their history, and provides them with a sense of identity and continuity. So you see here that we are speaking not about something static, not about something that we can conserve like a monument, but about processes, because identity is never given as a frozen, constant, stable element. It is always being done in a process, and thus we need to think in a more dynamic way about intangible cultural heritage, less static, which was more related to the 1972 Convention. So we see here a very broad definition, but also speaks about respecting cultural diversity and human creativity. And this respect for cultural diversity will also come back when we will speak at the end about the removals from the representative list, because we also have 2 examples of elements that were removed, deleted from the list. So to make it super simple, what is intangible cultural heritage and what it is not. What it is a living cultural practice, not a reconstruction of historical practices. This is very important because we see also in Poland that there are some initiatives aimed at a reconstruction, but we see that they are done for more accidental purposes than they could really be considered as intangible cultural heritage. So reconstruction would not be considered as ICH. We speak about the transmission within the communities, not about cultural content simply documented by a researcher. Documentation by a researcher could be helpful in understanding intangible cultural heritage, but simple documentation is not, if it is not living in practice in the field between the communities, cannot be considered intangible cultural heritage. So we speak about this transmission from generation to generation, and we speak about some practices that are done only within one generation and they die. So they cannot be considered intangible cultural heritage. And we also consider very important for intangible cultural heritage definition, the element of identity, not something that is done purely for stage purposes or for tourists. So when we see sometimes as tourists going to different countries, performances on stage, we shall think and consider if it is really intangible cultural heritage. In many situations, intangible cultural heritage is practiced within the community, and at the same time, there is this folklorized element for tourists and on stage. But if it is only done for stage purposes, then it is not intangible cultural heritage. So how ICH is manifested? It is important to understand that the manifestations are not limited to those that are listed in the definition. So we have 5 typical domains of intangible cultural heritage, but it doesn't mean that if some intangible cultural heritage practice does not fit perfectly to some of them, but it cannot be considered ICH. It could be considered ICH. So these are examples how to think about ICH, but it is not eliminating other forms of expression. So we have oral traditions, including language as a vehicle of intangible cultural heritage. We have performing arts. We have social practices, rituals, and festive events. We have also knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, and traditional craftsmanship. And probably I assume that your experience tells you, and this is my experience too, that in many, many cases of intangible cultural heritage, we could tick the box in more than one category. So traditional craftsmanship could be very much interlinked with knowledge and practices concerning nature, or with oral traditional expressions. So usually if you open up nominations from different countries, you will see that some elements are in compliance with 2, 3, 4, and in some cases even 5 domains. And so we are in the part when we speak about the definitions of heritage, and we speak about safeguarding. And you see, it is quite important that we use term safeguarding and not protection. These are 2 different terminological worlds. Protection is usually considered as a term that is linked with tangible heritage, whereas safeguarding is a little bit broader and It involves protection as one of elements, but also identification, documentation, research, preservation, promotion, enhancement, transmission, particularly through formal and non-formal education. So we safeguard ICH by learning how to do it, by sustaining the practice, as well as the revitalization of the various aspects of such heritage. So safeguarding is a very broad term, and I think it is important that when we speak about the 2003 convention, we speak about safeguarding, not protecting. So what will be specific in safeguarding ICH? And after the slide, we will have a 5-minute break to have something to drink and to rest a while. But I think that this slide helps to understand the difference and the struggles that we face when thinking about safeguarding ICH. It is not about safeguarding in the sense of the left corner picture, so the herbarium. We cannot treat ICH as a plant that we need to conserve, document, nicely describe, and put aside to some archive. Yes, we have this herbarium here, but this is not ICH because it's a dead plant. So it's a plant that could only be treated as an object, not as a subject of living practice. At the same time, we can see on the left down corner a botanical garden. So in all our countries, all of us have been at least once to some botanical gardens in order to cherish different beautiful plants, but not coming from our region, not coming from our country, not coming from our community. So these are species that we can cherish, we can observe, we can document, but they are placed in a context which is not natural for them. And we have the last...
Yok, satın alma borçlu vermek için. Nasıl bir şey istiyorsun? Bir bakıyorum.
Yeah, I think somebody... Yes, no problem. I think somebody didn't mute, and we need to mute.
Bir saniye şimdi oldu.
Okay, thank you. And the last picture, it is a meadow. It is a spring meadow, and I hope there is a beautiful spring right now, cherished also in Bulgaria. But as in the meadow, you can see very different plants. It is not something clean, in order, organized, archived, documented. It is a living meadow with different plants, with different organisms, with different animals living in this meadow. So actually safeguarding ICH is so complicated because it is not static and dead as in herbarium. It is not controlled as in botanical garden, but it is something that is changing in front of our lives, in front of our eyes, and something that could only be safeguarded when we are with it, in it, embracing it and cherishing it. And with this slide, I would like to invite you for a 5-minute break. It's actually the exact half moment of our training, and I would like to meet back in 5 minutes past 1. Is it fine for everyone?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go for a 5-minute break. I will give maybe one more minute because we started, I think, 2 after 1, so it should be 7 after 1, 7 after 2, sorry. We have time difference between Poland and Bulgaria. 2. Okay, so now I see on my clock that 5 minutes are finished. I'm just checking if translators are with me back. That's great, thank you. So let's come back to the convention, and now I would like to let's see why it's not working right now. Somehow, sorry, something happened with my screen. Okay, now it goes. Yeah. So we have done this first part of the convention, the preamble, the definition, the safeguarding, which is the purpose of the convention. And now let me move to the organs of the convention. Usually when you hear about the convention at the international level, you mainly hear about the decisions of the committee. But there are some other also important organs here, and the very important organ is the General Assembly of all states parties. Intergovernmental committee is only composed of 24 states parties, whereas the General Assembly is currently composed of 181 states parties. So it's really almost universal ratification. Only 13 states in the world did not ratify this convention. The Intergovernmental Committee is being organized by the Bureau of the Committee, and I will speak in a moment about the Bureau, and is obviously supported by the Convention's Secretariat, so the living heritage entity. And you may find sometimes the abbreviation LHE on different documents. This means that they belong to the documents produced by the Secretariat. And we obviously have an evaluation body, so the body that is very important for evaluating nominations. But these are not all bodies that are important. The body that could be very interesting for you, and I can see some even friends from this body on the list, is the ICH NGO Forum, which is a forum for all accredited non-governmental organizations. And these accredited NGOs are playing an important role because they can also advise intergovernmental community on different decisions. And they are actually right now the only forum for which communities, groups, and individuals could be represented, because there is no separate body representing communities, groups, and individuals. So actually, we have this very democratic potential to involve communities, groups, and individuals, but we have no organ that represents them. So NGO Forum, which is composed of very diverse NGOs, also NGOs representing bearers, so communities, groups, and individuals, is a place that helps to, and a forum that helps to connect with UNESCO, and also is a very important place of gaining experience, exchanging experiences, and gaining great friends. We have also a forum of global facilitators, thanks to which I am here today with you. This is another way of involving different people from different countries with their own perspectives on the discussions. And we also have the educational forum, which is the UNESCO chairs in ICH. We have currently 10 UNESCO chairs on different aspects of ICH. And we obviously have the very important regional centers in Sofia, which is organizing this event and this training. But there are also other Category 2 centers for intangible cultural heritage located in other regions. And you can see that we have 7 other Category 2 centers in Algeria, China, Iran, Japan, Peru, Republic of Korea, and United Arab Emirates. So how this all works together? Because I assume that you can feel a little bit but this is a huge number of different actors, but each actor is responsible for something different. So they are not in competition. So the General Assembly of all states parties in this convention is the assembly that takes the responsibility of the general way the convention is being implemented, developed, and changed. Because whereas we cannot change the text of the convention, what is subject to changes are the operational directives to the convention. And operational directives is a very important document, legal document, that is explaining in details how to do your activities as a state party to this convention. So it is in the operational directives where you will find the deadlines for submitting nominations, the procedure, languages in which the nomination shall be submitted, the ideas of how to implement the convention in the context of sustainable development. So it is not surprising that operational directives are much longer than the convention itself, but they are subject to change. And it is the duty and responsibility of General Assembly to discuss these changes and to accept these changes in the operational directives. Then we have the Intergovernmental Committee, so a much smaller body, which also meets much more often than the General Assembly. General Assembly meets every 2 years, and the next meeting of General Assembly will take place in June 2024. But Intergovernmental Committee meets every year, and it is a kind of a tradition here that it meets at the end of November, at the beginning of December every year. Last year, we had a meeting in Morocco, in Rabat. This year, in 2023, we will meet in Botswana. The Intergovernmental Committee consists of 24 states, but representing all regions of the world. And you can see that these regions are also represented in the Bureau of the Committee. Bureau of the Committee is, again, even a smaller body, but meets also more often and is dealing with more with the organization of the work for the whole Intergovernmental Committee. And you can see here at the bottom of the slide the list of the Bureau of the Committee that was adopted for the meeting in Morocco. And you can assume, obviously, that the Bureau will change for the meeting in Botswana, and definitely the chairperson of the Bureau will come from Botswana. Vice chairperson, again, represent different regions. So if we have the president of the Bureau from representing Arab states, then we will have Western Europe, Central Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia and Africa represented by vice chairperson. And we have here also a rapporteur from Peru. The main actually duty of Intergovernmental Committee is to take decisions regarding the inscriptions to the lists, to 3 lists. But it is not the sole duty. However, when the meeting takes place, it is the most important part in the agenda of the Intergovernmental Committee, because, as you may know, there are sometimes strong discussions about whether to ascribe one particular nomination or not. And in order to make this decision based on the agreed criteria, the Intergovernmental Committee is being prepared to take the decision by the draft decisions of the evaluation body. Evaluation body was not a body that was from the very beginning of the convention. At the first years of the functioning of the convention, Intergovernmental Committee decided itself about the nominations. But currently, with almost 60 nominations year by year that must be evaluated, we know that we need a specific separate body that will take careful care about assessing all the nominations, all documents, all consents of communities, all videos, all, you know, attachments that are coming with the nominations. So this is the duty of the evaluation body. And we have the Secretariat of the Convention that is actually instrumental for the functioning of this whole treaty, because it helps all other organs, it prepares documents, it is a place where countries go to consult different problems. So the Secretariat is a very important organ. Here is the evaluation body, because I think this will be of interest to you to understand that the evaluation body is composed of two sorts of representatives. There are experts who represent state parties, but these state parties cannot be members of the committee in order to avoid the conflict of interest. But there is also a group of accredited non-governmental organizations. So if your organization is accredited, you can check whether it is possible to apply and to submit the nomination of your NGO to be member of the hard work that is being done by the evaluation body. And here you can see the current composition of the evaluation body. So on the left side, you can see the NGOs, and on the right side, you can see the exact names of experts that are representing states parties to the convention. And they have really a tough work to do, very demanding, time consuming, and probably also sometimes nerves consuming, because these decisions are obviously discussed then at the international level. And in some cases, the suggestions made by the evaluation body, whether to inscribe an element or not, are not taken into account by the Intergovernmental Committee, because finally it is the Intergovernmental Committee that takes the decision on the inscription. So it can take into account the evaluation body opinion, but it is not bound by it. What makes sometimes different problems. And then when we speak about the inscriptions, we speak all the time about three listing mechanisms. We speak about the representative list, so the list that is very interesting for all the countries. And currently the list embraces almost 600 elements. We have the urgent safeguarding list, so the list that is aimed at helping states to safeguarding some elements that are under threat of extinction or under threat of being ceased to practice. And it has, as you can see, only 76 elements, so there is a less interest in this list. And the register of good safeguarding practices that I name a Cinderella of this list, because it is not, as you can see, so attractive, and only 33 elements are listed on this register. Thanks God we have Bulgaria there, and even few elements on this register, but the register is currently subject to reflection and possible future changes. Last week there was an expert meeting in Stockholm discussing the future possible changes around the register. These changes will be made in the operational directives. They will be presented to the Intergovernmental Committee in December, but as you might remember, they must be finally approved by the General Assembly that will meet in June. When it comes to the representative list, you can find there very, very different elements from different parts of the world. You may find some very popular elements like yoga. I remember when yoga was being inscribed, the discussion went into the direction that yoga is probably even more popular in the world than the list of ICH itself. But we have also reggae from Jamaica. We have the art of making pizza, not pizza itself. So this distinction between an element and the tradition of to prepare element. So we have, I would say, some elements of popular culture here, but we have also element from Bulgaria, the so-called multi-part singing, or from Poland, the tradition of crafting and building szopkas, reflecting the nativity scene. And it happens also in December every year in Krakow. When it comes to the Argent safeguarding list, we have 76 elements, and one of the, I think, very current and very well known right now is the culture of Ukrainian borscht cooking, which was inscribed for the first time as a case of extreme urgency. In July, this was an extraordinary committee session online only for one day due to the ongoing war in Ukraine. And this was originally planned to be submitted to the representative list, but because of war, it was submitted to the urgent safeguarding list and it was inscribed in this, for the first time, used procedure case of extreme urgency. But we have also Čubleta from Albania and other interesting elements on this intangible cultural heritage list in need of urgent safeguarding. When it comes to the register of good safeguarding practices, so this Cinderella of heritage lists, there is quite interesting situation because, as you can see, the register that was originally planned as an inventory of good practices that could be used in different elements of the world is dominated by European inscriptions. And Bulgaria, Belgium, Austria, France, Hungary, and Norway, I would say, are also leaders in this register. But it is quite worrying that in this register, we only have one element from Africa and one element from Arab states. So these numbers and this regional imbalance also made it clear that the register, the way it is constructed, the criteria for inscription shall be changed, and this is right now happening. And I would like now to tell you how the inscriptions are being made, and by comparing the inscription system of intangible cultural heritage to world heritage, in order to show you the similarities and in order to show you also the differences. When I spoke that international convention on world heritage was a pattern that was followed when the 2003 convention was drafted, I meant also the huge success of the World Heritage List. It was very debatable at the beginning whether the 2003 convention will have the same or similar listing system. For many experts, it was considered to be unacceptable. They were afraid that the craziness about the list and the power of the list will overshadow all other important elements. At some point, they were right. On the other hand, we can also argument that employing the listing system to the 2003 convention helped enormously, that this convention gained recognition, gained visibility, and that this topic is right now so popular. But how these decisions are being made? So first of all, it is state party that selects heritage element from its territory and prepare a nomination file. So we start at the national level. The nomination file then is being assessed by specialized evaluation bodies or expert organizations. In the case of the 1972 conventions, these are expert organizations, ICOMOS and EUCN. And these bodies made this recommendation, and this recommendation might be followed or might not be followed by the intergovernmental committees, because now we are in the third box, And in the third steps, the final decision on inscription or referral on non-inscription is being made by intergovernmental committees. And when the decision is being made, we have the inscription happening. And you can see three red words here: selection, safeguarding, and sharing. I call it 3 S's because this is what is happening in the UNESCO listing. We first select what we want to inscribe. By selecting and inscribing, we are safeguarding because we raise the visibility information. But in order to raise this visibility information and knowledge about the element, we need to share these knowledge and information. So these 3 S's, I would say, are helping to understand the phenomenon of the list. And at the end, we are tracing the UNESCO effect of the inscription. And I'm sure that in Bulgaria, you already have plenty of this discussion of the changes in practices that happen after they are made visible to the international level. Sometimes in Poland, it is called UNESCOization in the area where the location of heritage element is placed. So we see that this impact of inscription is happening. Sometimes it is very positive. Sometimes it needs to be moderated, especially famous cases of the World Heritage sites that were flooded by tourists after inscriptions were made so famous that that some measures protecting the sites after the inscriptions had to be introduced. So what are the similarities? As I told you, these are the 3 S's. We select these objects or practices, we safeguard them, and we share information about them. But what are the differences? And this shows us how far the 2003 Convention changed the way we think about heritage. Because in the World Heritage Convention, the most important concept was outstanding universal value, so-called OUV. In the 2003 Convention, we refrain from speaking about outstanding, universal, unique, authentic. These are considered taboo words. We rather speak about representativeness. We do not value and characterize the elements, but we try to show them as representing particular group's identity. In 1972 Convention, state control and management was the most visible element of governing the World Heritage sites. However, in the 2003 Convention, we have the paradigm of local communities first. Without their consent, without their active participation, without their wish and will to sustain the practice, safeguarding will not happen, and state actually cannot protect ICH practice. It must be safeguarded by the communities. And by safeguarding, we are not speaking about keeping frozen and keeping stable or static, something what is considered in the 1972 Convention as saved with all the values. But we speak, it is recreated, it is dynamic, it could be subject to changes. And also, we do not speak anymore about masterpieces, but we speak about identity processes, so a more complex approach to thinking about heritage. And this shift in the approaches in these conventions has been happening parallelly to the shift on the side of the academic reflection. So when we think about tangible world heritage, we usually speak about some paradigms that were expert-driven, they were focused on conservation, they were very state-centered and Western-centered, because the idea of grown monuments was very Western one. And the new research approach, which is called critical heritage studies, focus more on the communities So about the fact that we are all experts in our ICH. We do not need to have a title, academic title, but we are bearers of ICH. So de-expertization. We are focused on change, on resilience, and on adaptation of ICH practices. We are focused on communities, and we are also focused on other than the West parts of the world. Whoever this made it, whether this the westernized appeal happened to achieve a success is a very debatable thing, and I will speak about it in a minute. But also critical heritage studies helps us to understand that inscription is not everything, and maybe sometimes we should even not consider these as the sole element of safeguarding, because inscriptions is connected with selection, with exclusion, and with the processes of opening up some communities to different external forces. So we need to be critical and careful when we take the decision or we want to convince the community to go for international visibility. And this shall be done on the state level. By speaking about the convention, about the structure of the convention, I should also say that the convention is not the only instrument that is important for safeguarding ICH. It is the core instrument, but it is only one of many in this huge ICH safeguarding ecosystem. So we need to take into account that we have details regarding how the convention functions and how safeguarding ICH should function in operational directives. We have also specific rules of procedure for all the organs of the convention, because we need to know how to organize the meetings, how to organize votes, how to organize taking the decisions. We also have financial regulations of a special account for the fund. So these are these legal documents that are surrounding the convention. But we also have soft law instruments that were developed under this convention, those who will be also discussed in details by my colleagues in the next weeks. So I will just mention them here today. 12 ethical principles for safeguarding ICH and operational principles and modalities for safeguarding ICH in emergencies. Very relevant and important documents which are still a little bit underused. But we have also in this ICH ecosystem some legal and policy documents which were not developed by UNESCO, but by the whole UN system. UNESCO is a part of the UN system, United Nations system. So we have Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Covenants of Human Rights, but also rights of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we have this Agenda 2030 with Sustainable Development Goals. And this leads us to the latest document that is quite important for intangible cultural heritage, but for the UNESCO as a whole. You might remember that I mentioned the Mexico City Declaration adopted in 1982 that with this broad anthropological definition on culture. And 40 years after this declaration, a new declaration has been adopted titled Culture, a Global Public Good. So we have here the new concept that will be guiding us with thinking about ICH. It is a public good, that means it belongs to everyone, but it is also a responsibility of everyone to take care of it. And it is global because the phenomenon of culture is a global phenomenon. It's a phenomenon inextricably linked with human being activity on Earth. But why we need this declaration here? because the Agenda 2030 with Sustainable Development Goals adopted 17 goals, but none of them was strictly reflecting the importance of culture. There were sub-elements of importance of culture in the cities, but it was not acknowledged that culture is a driver of sustainable development too. And here this declaration speaks about the UNESCO potential as an organization that sets standards by declarations, recommendations, and international conventions. But also it very clearly speaks that we need to shift to participatory cultural policies involving a multiplicity of actors. And I would say this is a heritage of the 2003 convention that spoke about communities, groups, and individuals. So we clearly have the acknowledgement that in an international system where mainly states and governments are represented, we need to embrace more voices. We need to invite other stakeholders. And also, as you can see, there is a call to anchor culture as a global public good and to integrate it as a specific goal in its own right in the development agenda beyond 2030. 40 years after the Mexico Declaration and more than 70 years after the UNESCO was born, we come back also to the idea that it is needed to build peace in the minds of men and women. And you can see this are the words coming from the preamble of the Mexico City Declaration. So if you want to see the and to follow the next steps that will definitely come back and influence back also the 2003 convention, I invite you to follow the discussion around this new Mexico City Declaration. Coming to slowly to an end, I would like also to tell you, and using this Mondiacult declaration, because it's so, the abbreviation is Mondiacult, I would like to speak about the tensions that we observe in the UN system and that we observe in the 2003 convention. I spoke about the idea to de-Westernize the convention, so to give voices and visibility to heritage practices from other regions of the world than the West. So we clearly have a geographical imbalance problem because the World Heritage List was dominated and is dominated by today by inscriptions coming from the West. And we also have something what I call participatory struggle. So the initiatives to come to the international level with non-state actors' voices. And it is not an easy thing because international system is designed to listen specifically to states' representatives, not to other actors' representatives. But these two struggles, geographical imbalance and participatory struggle, are impacting also what is happening on the level of the 2003 convention. And here you can see the data that are taken from the UNESCO stats, illustrating this problem. In the World Heritage List, the dotted line, the highest line, shows the domination of the inscriptions coming from the region Europe and North America. On the right side, you may see this cumulative number of elements on intangible heritage list. And we can see that this doesn't look so bad. So we see that more or less regions are going with a similar number of inscriptions. Europe goes together with Asia and the Pacific by 2016. However, the longer the convention goes, the more inscriptions are coming from the West again. And currently, if you compare the number of inscriptions coming from different regions of the world, we see again the dominance of Europe and North America. And here you can see with this shadow green or celadon color, the representative list, and the blue one is the World Heritage List. When it comes to the number of inscriptions, we can see that European group is very well represented. European inscriptions, European traditions are very well represented. And this raised concerns on the side of other regions that feel discriminated, that feel that this is not the way it should be. And the discussion about geographical imbalance is happening right now during the meetings of intergovernmental committees. This concerns also the number of accredited NGOs. More than 50% of accredited NGOs come from Europe. So it makes again the problem of the how to credibly discuss the problems of different communities and different states in all regions of the world. I just wanted to flag this issue because this discussion is happening right now. Another discussion that is happening right now is this participation dilemma. We speak, and the convention is clear, that communities, groups, and individuals are the heart of the 2003 convention. Without them, we cannot speak about safeguarding ICH. However, as previously mentioned, they are not represented in the convention regime. There is no organ that will represent their voices. And if you think about the nomination procedure, they also could be detached from their nomination after the inscription, because the great majority of communities, groups, and individuals do not speak English and French, and these are the languages of the nomination. This discussion already happened, so now we have an option, and there is an encouragement to states to consider submitting their nominations in both, so English or French, and the language of the community. So in order to allow the communities still, after the inscription, to be part of it, to feel that they are part of the process. So check this out when you will be considering your nominations, that you take the language barrier seriously into account. And some elements that I spoke about earlier about the delisting, so the removals from the representative list. These are quite fresh examples, which happened in 2019 and 2022. They were considered after a very hot discussion as elements that shall not represent the heritage of humanity. This concerns the carnival in Aalst in Belgium, and the main argument was about the satirical anti-Semitic images of Jews that were taken, that were brought to the streets of Aalst as part of a carnival parade. This carnival parade embraced many different satirical depictions of different groups, but especially here with Jewish organizations, they felt that this is really raising anti-Semitism. And because the convention speaks about mutual respect, this was an argument that was shared by the committee, that because of this, we should delist this element. And the same happened 4 months ago in Morocco with another element from Belgium. This is an element of a broader multinational inscription and nomination with France on the parades of giants and dragons. And in one of the cities that took part in this very broad nomination, in At, there is an element in the parade that depicts the Black person as a savage, a person that is also, you know, in a form of a satirical or humorous depiction, but is based on stereotypes, because this Black person is in chains and resembles actually the moments of the history of slavery. So it was very clear in Morocco that this cannot be considered any longer as an element that shall represent intangible cultural heritage of humanity. So I think that we may also face in the future the revision of some elements that were inscribed to the list, because we change our sensitivity. We are more sensitive toward these situations. We are more sensitive globally towards inequalities and towards the heritage of colonialism. And this is something that I invite you also to follow, to understand the context of different discussions happening around what shall we celebrate as our shared heritage, as our common heritage of humanity. So summing up, I would like to come back to the origins of UNESCO. UNESCO, which is United Nations organization that deals with education, science, and culture. And despite the fact that the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention belongs to this pillar of culture, at the same time, it very much belongs to the pillar of science and education. And how? I would like to invite you to think about very diverse elements of heritage that are in fact embracing intangible cultural heritage. These are from Venice, which was considered as a masterpiece of tangible architecture, but today is also considered a place of intangible practices, also among the gondoliers. Through the first element of difficult heritage, the Auschwitz concentration camp, one of the first inscriptions from Poland to the World Heritage List, and the only concentration camp that was inscribed into the World Heritage List, not because of its unique architectural value, but particularly because of its intangible elements, of the history, the tragic history of Holocaust that is symbolized in this inscription. This was one of those fundamental discussions that happened in World Heritage Convention that used the so-called criterion 6, talking about these intangible values to decide about this inscription. But we can also think about tangible objects like szopkas in Krakow, which cannot be constructed, which cannot be crafted without intangible knowledge, intangible experience, but is learned and transmitted in Krakowian families. And even if we look into the great coral barrier reef in Australia, we do not only see today the natural beauty of it, but we also see intangible practices of indigenous populations living in the area and their interaction with the creatures, with the plant, with animals that live in the coral reef. And we are still on Earth here, but we can also think about the first step of a human being on the moon, which is taken as it is, as a sign of a boot, astronaut's boot, is probably nothing unusual, but as a sign of a first step of a human being on the moon, It brings this whole intangible tradition of thinking to what we are able as a humanity. And now there are also discussions about creating an instrument that will help to protect these first traces of human activities in the universe and in the moon on the level of the UN system. You can see the race moon is happening again. We can see many huge global companies that try to send their artifacts to different celestial bodies, to satellites. And so now we have a really like a universe very crowded by different objects. But at the same time, we would like to protect this sign of human history. So the intangible element is embedded both in tangible, both in difficult heritage, both in natural heritage, and even in heritage that is now being built around human activity in the earth. And all these three pillars, education, science, and culture, are needed to understand well how we interpret today intangible cultural heritage. So with this, I would like to end. These are things that I would like you to take away. 4 things about UNESCO, 4 things about the 2003 Convention. UNESCO is considered the most important universal international organization for culture and heritage. It helped to create enormously successful standard-setting instrument for heritage. It developed diverse policy instruments and is a platform for international dialogue. So it helps to build peace in minds of men and women. When it comes to the 2003 Convention, I would like you to remember that it is the most democratic, because of communities, international legal instrument that changed the way we think about heritage. It opened up our ways of thinking, what could constitute heritage. But it also heavily influenced national solutions. The concept of intangible cultural heritage, not known in any country before 2003, right now, 20 years after the convention was adopted, is more and more familiar, and it is creating its own history in our countries, and it is having its own unique heritage. So I would like to thank you in this place and ask if you have any questions. I'm open also to any comments, and I will be happy. Yes, I can see Plamena.
Здравейте! Искам да ви
Hello.
благодаря за интересната лекция. Вашата заплаха, че ще ни приспите в началото, се оказа неоснователна. И имам 2 кратки въпроса отзад напред. Първо по елементите, които са отписани от представителния лист. Въпросът ми е как са вписани на първо място, при положение, че член 1 на конвенцията поставя няколко изисквания извън предаване от поколение на поколение, а именно изискване за взаимно уважение на общностите. И този елемент на расизъм и антисемитизъм не ги ли имало и при самото вписване? И втория ми въпрос относно географския дисбаланс. От това, което представихте като процедури на ЮНЕСКО за вземане на решения за вписване, излиза, че в крайна сметка държавите са тези, които носят отговорност. И не е ли този дисбаланс причинен в някаква степен от незаинтересоваността на въпросните държави, отколкото някаква друга причина, или пък Междуправителствения комитет под някаква форма дискредитира тези държави при вземането на решенията? Благодаря ви.
Thank you. Very good comments. Let me start with the second one. So with geographical imbalance. Yes, it is in some cases the result of the lack of interest, but from the perspective of many countries, it is the structural imbalance related to the time of colonialism. And the economic resources that are much less available in developing countries. And so their ability right now to compete on the international market is perceived as not being caused by their action currently, but also as a historical consequences of being subjugated to colonial Western empires. So this geographical imbalance discussion is very intense. You are right, there are many elements here. It's a combination of many factors, but for many countries that feel that their regions are not represented enough, the factor that is being brought, the argument of colonial inequality and the colonial atrocities is very, very valid. When it comes to your first question, I'm not sure if I got it right. It was about the anti-Semitism, yes. So if you can maybe reformulate or once again ask me what you meant.
Да. Те са ги отписали заради антисемитизъм и расизъм. Но те не са ли имали при самото вписване тези елементи и едно от изискванията е именно уважение и взаимно уважение на общностите?
Yes, now I got it fully. Thank you. The problem with this inscription was that it came to the list through the program of masterpieces. So it was an old inscription when these standards were not so, I would say, set yet in the operational directives, so before the evaluation body. And in the general description of this multinational nomination, because there were two countries, France and Belgium, and several municipalities, there was no exact description of every carnival and of every element of this parade. So it was not visible. If you will read and open up this nomination, you will not even think that it could be there. So it came up a few years ago when the international press, got more interested, and different organizations could document also thanks to phones, to internet. All these things are much more easy to follow, even if you are not in the place. So I would say that it couldn't be evaluated the moment when it was inscribed, because there was no information in the nomination file. And as you may know, even in the current nomination files, you have also limit of words, and it's sometimes very harsh decision on what to put into the nomination and what not. And the problem is that the evaluation body cannot go to the field to check the practice. We have no money and no time in the system of the convention to do it. This is done in the World Heritage Convention, when we have the expert missions to the site. But in the 2003 convention, the evaluation body has to stick to the nomination file and cannot use information that are not in the file, even if they have their knowledge outside the file. So this was communicated openly by the evaluation body several times. So I'm not revealing any secrets here. This is a discussion that is happening. And probably there will be also some instruments of creating in-field missions in the case when the deletion is possible. So this is already an option, but it has not been yet used. It was really a great pleasure for me to meet you, and I would like to thank the Regional Center for this invitation. Thank you so much.